Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from burnout to imposter syndrome. If you can relate to the feeling that despite living in the information age, the world only seems to be making less sense, if you can connect to the idea that for some mysterious reason, it just feels especially hard to exist as a human in the world right now, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to help us think less about the things that don't matter and more about the things that do. I'm your host, Amanda Montell. Today, as a special Halloween episode, we're overthinking about death, specifically death in the digital age, through the eyes of today's very special guest, writer and author of the memoir Grief is for People, Sloane Crosley. Whew, death. It's a big topic today. I personally have been fascinated with death since I was a little kid. This is macabre, but I actually remember drafting my first last will and testament at the age of 15. I remember one day I retrieved some yellow construction paper and pink magic markers, sat down, and wrote a list that delineated less how I'd like my assets to be distributed — I didn't have much to my name at that point — and more what I wanted people to do with my ashes, how I wanted to be celebrated. I suppose it felt like the last opportunity to throw a real shindig, to assert my personality in the world. And there was some gallows humor in the exercise for sure, but I also think it was a very sincere attempt to familiarize myself with death, to make it feel more familiar, more intimate, less foreboding, to accept it. I sometimes think about how death is sort of the last truly animal experience we have in this ever technologically driven digital age. Sometimes I joke that it already feels like I am a robot whose consciousness has been uploaded to the cloud. I feel really disconnected from my body a lot of the time. These concepts intrigue me especially because I grew up in a family of atheists, so there was never really that comforting religious doctrine telling me that there was some utopian afterlife waiting for me on the other side. And on top of that, I really blame America's sort of puritanical, sterile, anxious, silent attitude towards death for so much of my fear and confusion about it. We have so little grief literacy in this culture. Death is such a taboo. Broadly, as a society, we, for the most part, don't talk about it. So starting from a young age, I found myself really embracing all the media that I could find about death, particularly the books and movies and TV shows that were darkly humorous. My absolute favorite TV show of all time is the acclaimed early 2000s HBO series 6 Feet Under, which is a dark dramedy about a family-run funeral home here in Los Angeles. One of my absolute favorite books is Mary Roach's Stiff: The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers, which is a laugh-out-loud and extremely fascinating, but also reverent, investigation of dead bodies. I think I've always just craved a permission structure to cozy up to death in a way that felt authentic and comforting, but also not sugar-coated to me. Because whenever someone in my family has died, absent of an organized religious affiliation, we've all felt a bit at a loss for how to celebrate and grieve that person. And I truly think that as our society becomes less traditionally religious and more technologically focused, our relationship to death is changing in some negative but other just plain curious ways. For example, several years ago, I wrote a piece for Marie Claire magazine called What It's Like to Die Online, in which I documented a community of chronically and terminally ill young folks who, in the face of a life-threatening medical diagnosis, decided to take to YouTube to chronicle their lives, their health journeys, and sometimes their deaths. For this community of chronically and terminally ill young people, YouTube provided a platform to not only share their health journey, connect with other people going through something similar, and keep their loved ones updated, but also to reclaim some agency over their lives during an extremely painful, unpredictable, and chaotic turn of events. What was especially fascinating to me was that some of these young YouTubers garnered hundreds of thousands of adoring admirers and fans. They were kind of like influencers, but their content was so different from the heavily filtered, overly perfect highlight reels that you might see from a fashion or lifestyle influencer. Watching a young person lose their hair and contend with blood clots in their lungs, displaying both fortitude and anguish in the face of that, seemed to really help some onlookers put their own lives into perspective. But I also found it to be such a trip that you could fall in love with someone's personality and feel like you were really getting to know them. Watch them go through this immense life journey, and then sometimes mourn their deaths, only ever knowing them parasocially through a screen. What I found so interesting about these young people's YouTube channels is that they left a gallery of these sort of imperfect artifacts of their lives in a way that could only exist now in the digital age. In a sense, whether they intended this or not, it was almost a way of cheating death. I wrote a bit more about this community of young YouTubers in a chapter of my book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, which covers a psychological phenomenon known as survivorship bias. But I've continued to be totally fascinated by this notion of death and grief in the digital age, how that distance between us and death is fluctuating or changing shape now that we have these tools like social media that could preserve a person's life in a way that's never been possible before. I often revisit the social media profiles of people who've died, and if it was someone that I knew but didn't see very often, or someone that I didn't know at all, it's almost as if they're still here. Death and grief in the information age are the subjects I really wanted to explore today. And to continue doing that, I want to introduce my special guest. Sloane Crosley is the author of many books, most recently the memoir Grief is for People, which details Sloane's experience in the wake of the untimely death of her best friend. Sloane Crosley is perhaps best known as a humor writer, so getting to read her on the topic of death felt really impactful for me. Sloane is also a personal hero of mine. She's one of the authors that made me feel like maybe I could be an author one day. Our conversation was truly an overthinker's approach to this idea of death in the digital age, so I hope you enjoy coming along for this somewhat meandering ride with us. And with that, here's Sloane. First off, thank you so much for joining the podcast. This is a show for overthinkers, so I'm going to lead with the first question that I pose to all of my podcast guests here, which is simply, or maybe not so simply, what is an irrational thought spiral that's been living rent-free in your head lately?
Oh, wow. You know, it's funny. I go to therapy to avoid irrational thought spirals. I mean, if it's a societal paranoia, anything involving the environment is usually that for me. I actually worked briefly on a show that was about the environment. I went out to LA and was in a writer's room for a while, and we had these experts come and talk to us. And something that one of them said was that, you know, when scientists and climate change experts appear in media and they say things are likely to happen or a certain percentage, it's because that's how they speak, because they don't speak in hyperbole. So the rest of us use the same language in that sort of Dumb and Dumber fashion, like, so you're saying there's a chance, you know, and we'd find the loophole to slip through. So when a scientist says there is a 75% chance that this is going to happen, the rest of us here, well, I suppose there's an outside chance it won't. And they can't, or they're screaming inside, absolutely it will. We just don't use numbers like that. Let's say if the bats that, you know, we often associate with disease, if the bats go, we very much need the bats, because then the mosquitoes can, speaking of living rent free, take over the world, and then we all die instantly when the mosquitoes take over the world. Or when there's climate change migration, we all die. Or when a glacier the size of Manhattan dangles and calves off of the North Pole and triggers earthquakes under the ocean. Lots of fun, cool stuff like that, which I will stop answering your question, but in a way your question lends itself to a long hyperbolic answer because it's about something you can't get out of your head.
Oh, absolutely. No, you answered that question perfectly.
Anyway, How fun. Should we go back to just normal death? Just like average death might have been a little more palatable than what I just said.
Yes, back to the comparatively quaint notion of average death. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. I was literally just this morning having a conversation with a close friend about how developing a gratitude practice can be so effective at helping those of us who are prone to overthinking get out of our own heads or soothe our perfectionistic tendencies. But for an overthinker, sometimes we need a little help cultivating a gratitude practice, and that's where therapy can really come in handy. For me, therapy has served a different role in my life at different times. There have been times in my life when I've gone every single week without fail, and there have been other times when I kind of just like drop in on an as needed basis. Because maybe during those times, it's like I've already learned and I know my healthy coping mechanisms and tools, but maybe I'm a little rusty. So I could use an objective professional or even a brainstorming partner in the form of a therapist to get back on track. I actually used BetterHelp when I was in between therapists, and I was super intimidated by the process of having to find someone new. So if you're thinking of starting therapy or getting back into therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, and then you get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime at no additional charge. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/magical today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/magical. First, I want to say I loved your book.
Thank you.
Slurped it up. Maybe that's not the most appropriate way of phrasing that, but we will talk about gallows humor later. I want to lead with this question. You say early in your memoir, and this is a sentiment that lives rent-free in my head, that humans are the only species that experiences denial. I really felt that. I feel like as a species, we are always trying to cheat death, reckon with death, negotiate with it. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how these attempts at cheating death are different now in the information age. Like, what about living in this particular time in history has changed that experience?
Well, I imagine it's made it exponentially worse and also given us this false hope at the same time. So everybody knows if something's wrong with you and you go and you Google what's wrong with you, like WebMD or anybody will say, I'm sorry that you sprained your ankle. It looks like you have cancer. You know, it's like all roads lead to the hospital.
Yes.
So in a way, it's sort of taken this kind of stratosphere of death that circles the earth and like shrunk it and hugged it close to us. So it just feels closer, like we can touch the ceiling and there it is. But in another way, there's all these like tips and tricks for how to prolong your life. And some of them are probably legitimate, like eat more blueberries and salmon, try getting up from the desk, see what that might be like. And then some of them are a little scary, like cryogenically freeze your head and ingest a metric ton of colloidal silver and just like, let's just roll the dice. But I think that there's a history of that though, right? Because I think way before the internet, we were taught about like the cave people and how, well, the life expectancy for, I'm just going to say like an Australopithecine or whatever that stage was like, you're an old man at 30, right? Like if you live to 30, it means that somehow you have coincidentally not run into the saber-toothed tiger or like the toothache that would kill you, And so I think there's this idea that like we will perpetually keep living longer because that's how the trajectory has happened, and like, our great grandparents had a shorter life expectancy than our current grandparents and so forth and so forth. But I imagine we're hitting a wall. I should maybe identify myself as not a scientist or a doctor or a biologist, only on podcasts. I don't know, but it just seemed like at a certain point, actually, we're not all going to live past 100.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah, I really do have this delusion that by the time I'm 100, the life expectancy will surely be
130.
Yeah, 130.
But do you want this? That's what's weird about denial and about our sort of immortality, and also dovetails nicely with the plot of every vampire movie. Do you want this? Do you want to keep going indefinitely? I mean, maybe out of curiosity. I don't know.
Yeah. because sometimes I feel like, and this sounds terrible and I'm not even sure I mean it in earnest, but sometimes I do have this feeling of like, oh God, am I really only 32? Like, how can that be? Like, God.
There's just more of this.
Yeah, like, you're kidding me. I have to be the custodian of more memories.
But I think that's another thing that human beings have a low tolerance for. And in other words, I think that denial is exclusive to human beings, but also the intolerance of boredom. I mean, I really don't feel like a squirrel when it's bored is like, ugh, if only I could be a dolphin. What,
No.
how great.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Animals are so present, and that must help not only with anxiety about death or anything else in the future, but also boredom. Yeah, so true. Okay, so your book, for those who haven't read it, is kind of, I don't want to say an ode, but I think a really, really beautiful tribute to this dear friend of yours who died by suicide. And you say in the book that upon hearing the news of his death, you immediately tried to pretend that it was old news or that this was information that you already knew. And these two exercises were coping mechanisms. You detail several of these same sort of superstitions. You mention in the book that you threw away the dress that you were wearing the last night that you two had dinner. You Googled the word Russell, expecting to see photos of just him. I have done similar things in the wake of grief. So I'm wondering, in the aftermath of Russell's death, what was the sort of most irrational thing that you did in an attempt to cope, unconsciously or consciously? And did any of that magical thinking actually help?
Well, it's more of an elegy, I think, than an ode. I think in terms of crazy behavior, it wasn't any one thing. It was that I truly felt, and if I'm honest, a tiny part of me still feels, and it's still something I try to work through. I think the entire book is the craziest thing I did because I really, there's a line in it where I mention something about storytelling. There's a sort of storytelling theme in the book. And I say something like, who would know better than you, meaning myself, who would know better than you that you truly believe that if you write the best story that you can, he will hear you. And I think that is the craziest act, is the book itself, not anything that's really described in the book. Although there is some like crazy hostility. I probably wouldn't behave the way I behave then now. At some point, like a guy in a city bike rolls by and like kind of brushes my wrist, which granted has never happened before or since. I've never been touched by a city bike, And my reaction to that was to genuinely run after this guy for 2 blocks. And I was like screaming that he go fuck his mother. And I mean, I'm like not a public person, but like it's, I live in New York with my neighbors. That's embarrassing.
Oh, that's funny. Everyone in New York is a public person.
Everyone in New York can be spotted somewhere else. Everyone's had that experience where I'm like, oh my gosh, I saw that guy on like the Uptown N train this morning. What's his day like?
I love your comment that the whole book was like this mystical seance-esque bid to speak to him. And that if you wrote well enough, it would pierce the veil somehow and you would get to Russell. That feels like some sort of Greek myth, or actually, in a way, a sort of literary prayer, a literary form of prayer, which is, of course, a very common classic form of magical thinking that religious and I guess even non-religious people engage in when someone they love dies. My next question is related to just my continued fascination with death in the digital age. I found it so interesting that you made the observation in the book that Russell's last written words were an Instagram caption. And I'm curious, how has his internet presence affected the way you've experienced his absence?
Oh, wow. Wow, that is a really good question, which makes it sound like I'm filibustering. Like a politician. Like, I'm so happy you asked that, Susan, about bike lanes or something. No, the thing is his presence was so tied to his job. So he ran the publicity department for Vintage Books and Anchor Books. And so much of his personal Instagram, his Twitter feed, everything about him online that you would see a quote from him or a video is about books. So I'm glad in a way that the book might have this long tail effect where if, it reaches enough people, or even if it only reaches one person, which is what apparently the goal of art, all art is. If you only reach one person,
Right.
and that person gets curious and starts Googling, they'll find him recommending the books he loved. And so I feel like I kind of love this inverse thing. I mean, it does make me a little nervous that like no one seems to know how to lock his freaking Instagram feed. And there's nothing weird on there, just some personal stuff where I'm like, I don't know if people need to see him and his partner playing with the dogs or being at their house, or, him coming from the gym and taking a selfie. But there's nothing salacious. It is actually, even that is mostly book recommendations. But he didn't have an excessive online presence, maybe because he was 52 when he died, and this was in 2019. And so he wasn't really of the generation that's like, I'm going to share my every thought. I actually also talk about in the book where every once in a while to hear his voice, I'll look up a video of him. But the truth is that the videos that are online are like him introducing an author at Comic-Con or some C-SPAN event or some like PEN America award. And so they're him, but there's an extra layer of them not really being him because they're so formal. It's not like a selfie situation. So it's unfortunate that I don't have more of him in that way that the internet can provide. Like, in other words, if God forbid, knock on wood, either of us are hit by an exploding manhole cover tomorrow, I think that you and I will both have more of a digital footprint or, just some sort of things that people can look up. This very interview is very meta, but Russell doesn't really have that.
It is a very meta thought. And I also feel sort of personally dissonant about it because in one way, it's probably lovely for him, whatever that means, because he's entitled to some privacy, Like there are just these couple photos of him from his private life. But I don't know, for me, well, I guess once I'm dead, I won't care. But I feel so torn about my internet presence in the context of death because in one way, I'm like, well, I'm glad there will be some record of me. And I think humans have always wanted there to be a record of us. It's why like ancient man left handprints in caves. But at the same time, I'm like, well, I want a private death, in a way. Like I want to just disappear like humans always did in the good old days. So I wonder, I didn't plan to ask this question, but have you assigned someone like, I don't know, a PR rep to manage your death?
That'd be hilarious if I had done that, but like not a will, just a PR person. I mean, actually, honestly, frankly, that I think I'm describing Prince's death, where they're like, we don't know what's going on. The estate's all over the place, but the PR rep is there. No, not at all. I mean, I think the thing is yes, I guess in that sense, it's out of your hands. I wonder if the vanity will persist until the dying day. And I'm like, oh man, people are going to use photos that they're like, she's so happy. I'm like, but she's got a receding gum. I don't know. But, from some angle I don't like, which actually was a huge concern. The answer to your question is just a short answer is no. But the long answer as it pertains to Russell is like, New York Magazine ran this excerpt of the book and they asked for these photos of him. And they even had seen some on his Instagram, but of course they can't legally, print those. I was going back through old photos and I'm like, I'm just looking through these photos thinking he's going to murder me. He's going to murder me. Like I can't send these photos to New York Magazine, And then one was actually very upsetting because I'm pretty bulletproof when it comes to this topic at this point in terms of like crying on stage or during an interview. But I found, actual pre-Instagram, I've known him since I was 25. So I found actual, photos in a shoebox. And one I'm like 24, 25, and I'm in this white bikini and in some sort of summer situation, obviously not in the office. And I remember him saying, and it was the only time I cried recently about this, is that I remember him saying in that moment after the flash went off, you'll be so grateful you have this photo one day. And he meant because I'm 25 and I'm wearing a white bikini, not so you can send it to New York Magazine because I have died by suicide. And I just cried so hard as if it had happened yesterday. Like it had been a really long time since that sort of uncontrollable crying where you actually really, at a certain point, you let it all out and you would very much like to stop. And you almost have this like kind of like looking at yourself in the mirror being like, stop it. And I just couldn't make it stop. But so I remember after I published my first book, after I published I Was Told There'd Be Cake, and it hit the bestseller list, which was great. And a surprise, my friend Dave, we were standing on some rooftop party that had like a kind of clear glass partition between us, or kind of railing balcony between us and, the entire city, and plummeting to our deaths. And it was a little bit of an optical illusion and kind of scary. And he was like, what's funny? He's like, now if you fell, you'd get an obituary. I'm like, wow, that's vaguely threatening. I'm going to go get a Negroni. But yeah, so it was a weird kind of thing to think that part of the whole reason I wrote the book is because it's such a tribute in a way to people who work behind the scenes in the arts, which is a person who I was for a very long time before I sort of crossed over to that version of the other side. It's a strange thing to think about that, I'll probably get an obituary. I hope it's big.
Yeah, I hope that for you. Oh, well, that's very interesting, though, because, of course, not every individual alive will get a big, splashy New York Times obituary. But in a way, our Instagrams, like our internet presences, give each of us
almost like a premature obituary.
Yeah, like I'm constantly preserving my legacy. I think anyone who uses social media kind of is, right? Which is in a way morbid, but also in a way beautiful, because if you dare to share bits of your real imperfect life, then there's a record of you that might even be more impactful than like a stilted obit.
But do you think, though, that you need to use social media in order to have that preservation? I mean, I am much more freaked out in terms of my own technological foibles at the idea of like the cloud collapsing completely and all my photos going than Instagram being down forever tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? Because it's more about what I have than what I've shared, and then just hope that somebody can get my phone password, which is real easy.
Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes secretly fantasize about that happening.
Wait, which, the Instagram thing, or like all your photos are gone?
All your photos are gone. Because I guess I have a sort of delusional nostalgia for a time before iPhones when the only photos exist of my grandma are ones where she looks amazing because she dressed up for a party and there was a Polaroid camera there, or she went and she got her portrait done. And I do try to take Polaroids and stuff like that sometimes because in a way I don't want to feel reliant on the digital artifacts. Like I feel like they're worthless somehow. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. But it's also the MO of the day, which is in a way a gift. I'm sure if, Vermeer could have painted 7 paintings a day, he would have, especially him. But yeah, I mean, I think that in a way we give ourselves a very hard time about how reliant we are of camera being in our phone and all of that stuff. It's a gift as long as you're not addicted to it and addicted to like playing too much with the image or obsessed with the angles too much. But at the same time, like your grandmother would never have allowed herself to be photographed, period, without probably makeup and a hat. The same thing with my grandma. I mean, I feel like some casual shots that I value very much are sort of candids of her cooking in a tiny galley kitchen somewhere on the Lower East Side, but like there are very few of them.
So we're obviously chortling a fair bit here about death and grief, and your book is very funny. Of course it is. It's you. I laugh so many times. I actually want to read one moment, which I feel like encapsulates the kind of humor in this book. I copied and pasted it here. At one point you say, "Now that Russell is dead, I can label this state of perpetual vigilance as I could not before. Rather, a professional can. What I am experiencing is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD employs a math opposite to that of denial. Instead of your brain convincing itself that nothing has happened, it convinces itself everything has and is still happening, which could explain why I start doing head counts, calling up everyone I've ever known who's been depressed to see if they're okay. Half my friends are writers. The other half work with writers. This takes days." I just absolutely love moments like that, which are dark but truly so funny. And I don't know what I would do without gallows humor. I do admittedly sometimes go too far with it. I write and speak humorously about cults and delusion and so many macabre subjects. It's a fine line.
And very well about those things.
Oh, well, that's nice. But I'm curious because this book is a bit darker than others that you've written in the past, but still feels so you. And I'm wondering about the role of gallows humor in your own writing and coping.
Oh, man. I think that you have to feel it out, right? You have to know, like, tonally what's untouchable and what's not. I mean, for the most part, I find it very welcome. As someone who was traditionally before this, and I guess still gets labeled as a humorist, I feel like there's nothing you can really say to me that I haven't thought worse. There's some interview I read at some point with Tina Fey. I'm not putting myself in the ring with Tina Fey. I just related to the quote where she talked about when she first became the head writer for SNL, where she said something like, a average person, a normal, well-adjusted human being, thinks it's funny to dress Will Ferrell up like an old lady and push him down the stairs. A comedy writer thinks it's funny to push an old lady down the stairs. Like, it's an incredibly dark, weird brain that you're dealing with. So I feel like the place of gallows humor is like sometimes it's really welcome. And then sometimes I feel like if I sense someone's being flip, I'll shut off very quickly. And I'll be like, no, I don't get it. I'll just sort of let them, if I may, give them enough rope to hang themselves. See, there it is. There it is. But I feel like in terms of my own writing, it's just how I process things. And the way I always think about Russell specifically, or about this book, or really I think most people who have lost somebody, you wouldn't miss them if you miss them in one dimension. If they weren't 3D to you. And part of that is all the different facets of their personality. And surely they were a little funny, or a little kind, or a little neurotic, or a little annoying, or just generous. Like, there's something, there's some sort of like variance to their personality. So I think that I use it to capture the person I miss so other people can recognize the people they miss as well.
I love that.
Also, I have to say, I mean, I don't really want to delve too far into the horror of it, but it's a way of not letting the death itself, if it's a very bad death, cannibalize the life and the memories of the life. I think when someone dies of any kind of disease, even if it's prolonged and that's horrible, you can more easily separate it than you can if, God forbid, someone dies in a school shooting. And a suicide is a similar way, where it sort of works backwards. And you have to protect that person's whole life that they had that is not defined by this, from your own inquisition and curiosity about what their last days were like. You have to protect it. And I think humor is an extremely good way to protect that person's life and their legacy.
Oh, wow. That makes me think of a very dark story that I think I'm going to tell because it's relevant. So a few years ago, one of my mom's closest friends was murdered. She was a very, very special person. She was a scientist and a concert pianist and a karate master. Like, this Renaissance woman had so many dimensions, and the way that she died was so horrible that, yeah, it definitely contaminated the vibrance and specialness of her life in a way that made me so angry. And I didn't even know her. But my mom read me the eulogy that she gave at her friend's memorial, and it was funny. And for a second, it made everybody forget the way that she died. And so, yeah, that was just a really good point that you made about the power of humor in the wake of death. My next question makes reference to the title of your book, Grief is for People. The point is made in the book that grief is a specific emotion for mourning a person, not a thing, because there's also a robbery plot point in your book where you lose a bunch of things. Grief does not apply to that experience. Anyway, we're talking about death in this current time in history. How do you think that modern consumerism, being too obsessed with things, anthropomorphizing things, skews our perception of actual human loss during this ever consumerist era?
It's a great question. And it's so funny because the way you phrased it, for some reason, all I'm thinking of right now is the opening of the major motion picture Fight Club. Just because it's like he's obsessed with ordering all this stuff from catalogs and, the things you own you. And then, his whole life is he just cracks and his whole life blows up and he sets fire to everything. I think we just live in a time where we just want to sort of lobotomize or like just zone out. And like so much of what is being sold to us is being sold for comfort. If it's not built for comfort, it's built for aspiration. And that is its own sort of comfort. If only, then I'll be okay.
Oh my gosh. So that actually made me instantly think of a consumer brand called Calamity Ware that sells high-end home goods, like dishware products. It's called calamity ware. They're these beautiful like mugs and saucers that are toile printed.
But that are like nuclear resistant? I mean, what for?
No, not even. It's exactly what you said. It's this line of beautiful comfort items. Like they even have a collection called Things Could Be Worse. It's just a collection of products that have nothing to do with the end of the world or surviving the end of the world, you know, like a Stanley Cup keeping water cold even when the earth is burning or whatever. No, it's literally just a luxury to enjoy while the earth is still intact. I think that's the underlying message.
Wow.
And I feel two ways about it because on one hand, it's ironic. It's a bit. That is gallows humor. But it's also a bit catastrophizing. And then it's like, what? We're all just the boy who cried apocalypse. And we're constantly saying it's the end, it's the end, it's the end. So by the time the end actually comes, or not the end, but calamity, real calamity, we don't really know how to manage it. In part because of this mass commodifying of doom and grief and death. Does that make sense?
Well, we're numbed and we're inert. But I think the problem, or like more to your core of your question, is like we're all out of the language and all out of the emotions and reactions when we need it.
Mm-hmm.
So even like with this book, my inbox has been a little more active than it normally is with people telling me their stories of either that the book moved them, or usually they come in tandem with their own experiences of suicide and or of just death in general. Sometimes it's a divorce, sometimes it's just loss of any kind. But I write back and I'm like, I am truly so sorry, but I'm all out of words. Unfortunately, I've said that when people have stubbed their toes or been laid off from their jobs. And so now when like the shit really hits the fan, it sounds like I don't mean it. You know, it sounds like lip service, or that's just what you say, or like what I printed out on a Hallmark card. And so it's like the same thing we use positively when people are like, maybe with the calamity where people are like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. I'm like, are you? Do you need psychological help? Is there a restraining order involved? Are you really obsessed with this vase or this candle? And I feel like it's all well and good until it's very numbing when you need it.
I just have one more question, and then we're going to do a little bit of a lightning round based on some thought spirals that listeners submitted. But I think this is actually a good question to end on because your book and my new one both reference the iconic observation that Joan Didion made in her memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking, about how the mind tends to really buckle during times of grief, personal or collective. For example, Didion talks about how she refused to give away her late husband's shoes because she thought if she did, that meant he for sure was not going to come back. And I'm wondering, how do you think this sort of collective grief in our society is causing us to think more magically?
But I think that what happens is it becomes more pathological, that kind of grieving, that kind of thinking that the world is going to end, that kind of upset. And so it works a little, if I might throw some minor shade towards the New York Times style section. Someone has an idea that there's a trend, and then they go out looking for bullet points to fill that trend. So they saw two people wearing shirts with pineapples on them, and then they just are now looking. They're just looking until they have 5, boom, file the piece. You know, and it's not that it's not real. And I don't want to sort of collectively gaslight everybody into being like, oh no, everything's the same as it ever was. Mm-hmm. But I just think you have this nugget of realism that then spirals out and we fixate on it and it becomes pathological.
You know, it really reminds me of this bias called frequency bias, which describes our penchant to, say, take note of one phenomenon once and then suddenly see it everywhere as if it's like a sign from the universe. You know, for example, your loved one dies on April 30th. Now the numbers 4 and 30 appear to you everywhere you turn as if they're a symbol or message from the great beyond. And I think we fall prey to that bias because in times of grief, it makes us feel taken care of, like there's an order to things in the universe. And I think during times of collective mourning, we also want everything to feel organized, even if it feels bad, because at least it feels like there's a purpose behind it.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that there's some sort of method to the madness.
Yes.
Well, it just feels like someone's driving the car, right? Would you rather go off a cliff in a self-driving car or with a getaway driver? And you're like, well, maybe honestly in a weird way with a getaway driver, because at least I know there's some sort of intent. This isn't some glitch in the system and I've died for no reason.
Yes, exactly. No, like we definitely prefer there to be intentionality behind things because we can relate to that because we do things on purpose. Okay, so now I have a series of thought spirals related to the concept of death in the information age that were submitted by some of our overthinking listeners. Follow us on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers to participate in future lightning rounds. So I'm just going to present each one to you, Sloan. They're kind of in the form of yes or no questions, so I'll ask you each one and then ask you to respond to them kind of quickly.
This is fun. You haven't asked me anything yet. Could be horrible. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is kind of fun because it's almost like a game. All right. First thought spirally question goes like this. Do you think living in the digital age has rendered us so disembodied that we actually understand death less than ever?
Yes.
Can you really die in the digital age?
Yes. Well, we've been talking about like the memories continuing on and on. You can die.
Right. And I also received a question that's similar to this, which is like, in the near future, will life turn into that Black Mirror episode where AI can recreate us? And I don't know. I think we're already on our way there. You know, if you like upload a bunch of footage of your dead loved one, you can.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, there's a giant cryogenic freezing facility in Michigan as we speak. Okay, next question.
Yeah, great. Okay. So this relates to a point that you made in your book about having imposter syndrome when you lose a friend as opposed to losing a member of your family or a lover because you didn't share a bed with them, is how you put it. So it somehow feels like the grief is less valid. Someone asks, is losing a friend somehow actually worse because society views it as less of a big deal?
No, I don't think it's worse. I'm going to go ahead and say no.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're probably getting at the idea that there probably isn't quite as much empathy maybe for losing a friend as opposed to like losing your spouse.
I mean, I think the thing is, I think it is antithetical to the to all sort of humanity and empathy to be forced to do a would you rather game.
Right.
You know, would you rather lose a child or lose a friend? I don't want to answer that question, and I think everyone knows the answer anyway.
The last question here is it bad that when someone posts online about their loved one's death, I instantly want to know how?
Oh, no. No. I think it's human curiosity. I think that's okay. I think that the part of you have free reign over your brain to think whatever you want and to be curious. I think if you DM them and say, how, when, send me a photo, you're crossing over into bad person territory, but don't do that.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Don't do that. Also, I do think when it comes to death, even the news of a stranger's death that you might see online or something like that, a lot of the time, the curiosity is motivated by self-preservation. Like, we want to know how someone else died to assess whether or not that cause of death is a risk to us so we can figure out if we need to take action to prevent it from happening to us. And then the other point is that death literacy and grief literacy are so miserably, barely existent in this culture. So we often don't know where the line is between appropriate and inappropriate. But this is the line. I think this is the line, kids. So actually, I lied before. I do have one very last question for you. And it goes like this. With regard to death in the information age, what do you think is the one thing that we're overthinking the most? And what is the one thing that you think we're underthinking the most?
Oh, wow. I think we overthink legacy. I think we overthink that kind of perception stuff because we're still attached to our earthly concerns for good reason. What we're underthinking, I would recommend, there's a Roz Chast graphic novel that won a bunch of awards a few years ago called Can We Please Talk About Something More Pleasant? And it's about the death of her parents and the sort of palliative care and what the end of life really looks like. And it's not glamorous and it's horrible. And I think that we tend to not really look at the sort of physical and financial burdens that death, both in the immediate time preceding it and in the time right after it, brings to the living.
Mm-hmm.
And we're more concerned about Hollywood death, you know? And I feel like because, like you said, we don't really talk about it enough, it's not just that we don't talk about it in terms of empathy for each other and in terms of ceremony and how we deal with it. I mean, I suppose if you're very religious, you do quite a bit, but most people don't, at least not that I know. But in addition to that, it's just that means that what that takes down with it is just the practicality of what you do. What you do when someone's dying, what you do right after someone dies. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there the night that Russell died, but someone else was, and they had to deal with stuff that I'm sure you just don't think about at all. So we're just so unprepared for the actual end of life, just both emotionally and practically unprepared. So I really would recommend that graphic novel. It was really good.
Ooh, that makes me want to recommend a book now that we're talking about it, about death and grief practices. It's called From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Dowdy, who is known by some as the Millennial Mortician. I'm a big fan of her, and she wrote a fantastic, riveting book about death care practices around the world called From Here to Eternity. I recommend it. But your point actually connects in a very full circle way to the first question of the day, which was about denial. There seems to be almost this like American delusion that we are each the exception and we're not going to die and we're going to win.
Yeah. It's not just American, it's childlike.
Yeah,
it's
childlike.
Stunted. Kids think that, as they well should. Children should think that. That is your gift and your right as a child that should not be taken away from you. Not to make things too political, but to think that you're not safe in your home for any reason, you know, that is the robbing of childhood for somebody. I don't really know what the age is where you no longer have the right to think that you're going to live forever, but I'm going to say it's definitely before, like, I don't know, 40. Like,
Wow.
you know, like wake up. I know this is strange, but I think you'll get this. Maybe more than most. It doesn't have to be morbid. Conversations about death do not have to be morbid or macabre. You know, they're part of the thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And may I please ask that you let listeners know where they can find your book and anything else that you're working on?
I'd be so glad. Bookshop.com is a great place because then it can go to any local indie bookseller. It's a great place. Your local indie bookstore. Amazon is great. No one will come and hunt you down and kill you if it's the same place where you get sponges. But really, your local indie bookseller is the best place to get it. I mean, libraries carry it as well. But yes, I would say your local indie bookseller or Barnes & Noble or Amazon are the places to get it.
Lovely. Thank you so much again. Thank you, magical overthinkers, so much for listening. Now's the point in the episode where I share a little tidbit of evidence-based advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This one comes from a 2023 New York Times piece titled How to Stop Ruminating by Hannah Seo. This tidbit might sound self-evident, but I think it's a useful reminder, and it's something that has totally improved my mental health. It simply has to do with avoiding your triggers. Triggers which might not even seem that traumatizing or extreme. I sometimes have shame about my triggers because I don't feel like there's something that should trigger me, but that shame is helping no one. The piece says the following, quote, "If watching a Hallmark movie brings up overwhelming memories of the loss of a family member, or if scrolling through social media leads to an unhealthy fixation on your appearance, avoiding these triggers can help interrupt such thoughts," said Jody Louise Russell, a doctoral student who studies the philosophy of rumination in depression and anxiety at the University of Edinburgh. This quote goes on to say, "Avoid the internet or certain types of media altogether if you find that they're doing more harm than good." Avoiding the internet is sometimes easier said than done. But for me, I at this point have put an all-out ban on checking my Apple Podcast reviews. It sounds silly because why should anyone care what a stranger's opinion of one podcast episode you made might be, but I have just found that I am entirely too sensitive, and it is not worth the risk of hoping you find something positive and then accidentally stumbling across something really mean for me to have any access to the Apple Podcasts platform. This is just one example, and I do beseech you to leave a positive review of this show if you like it, because it does allegedly help. I just don't think it's natural to be exposed to that many opinions from strangers. So that is just one instance of a corner of the internet that I avoid. And simply putting a moratorium on it has helped me enormously. No matter if it's silly, in scare quotes, or not, avoid the corners of the internet and media that make you feel terrible. And with that, thanks again for listening. Until the next thought spiral, think it over. Just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical manager, Katie Epperson, coordinator, Reese Oliver, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com.